Well, seldom, if ever, has there been such a dramatic and rapid policy capitulation by an Australian government. The resource super profits tax had a lifespan of just 8 weeks before being put out of its misery on Friday morning. Resource tax Mark II was conceived with Labor PM 2010 Mark II after an all-night love-in on Thursday. Neil Woolrich reports.
Oh, you're gonna get whacked.
Tens of thousands of jobs.
You're gonna get whacked.
Not just
These were the advertisements the mining industry was planning to roll out from today if the miners failed to negotiate a truce with the government over the resource super profits tax.
Somehow, some way, there's a price to pay.
Oh, you're gonna get whacked.
There's going to be lots of sparks fly.
But after a 2-month stoush, it's the RSPT and one of its chief spruikers, Kevin Rudd, who've now been whacked.
There will be a negotiated profit-based tax regime, but there will be no resources super profits tax.
This is a considerable improvement on the former proposed super mining tax. It's unfinished business. We've still got a lot of work to do.
The miners' rebellion was led by BHP Billiton's chief executive, Marius Kloppers, who's been granted each item on his wish list.
Don't go back on investments that have already been made. Keep it internationally competitive. Keep it differentiated between different products. Please don't tax infrastructure because we need more of it to grow our exports.
We're moving forward.
The Gillard government has addressed all of those concerns and more, proposing now that coal and iron ore projects will be subject to a mineral resource rent tax levied at 30%. Oil and gas will come under the existing petroleum resource rent tax, while all other minerals will be excluded. The uplift factor, or the return on investment companies can make before the tax kicks in, will be the long-term bond rate plus 7%. Companies can choose to value their assets at either book or market values when calculating profits, which removes one of the main drawbacks for existing projects. Projects will get a 25% extraction allowance that reduces their taxable profits. There will be no refund for project losses, and the taxing point will be the time the mineral is extracted, or the mine gate, to ensure that companies aren't taxed on the value that their infrastructure adds to a commodity.
It's a balanced outcome for the Australian community, and it's a balanced outcome for the minerals and petroleum sector in Australia, because it means that we have certainty and ongoing investment.
The fundamental shift here is away from a super profits tax and into a resource rent tax, and this is a real rent tax. In other words, it's a tax on the resource and not using super profits as a proxy for that tax.
But not everyone is happy. Small miners say the deal favours the big international players.
It's effectively provided them an advantage, and it's provided them more protection to keep us out of growing ourselves to become those great Australian companies that we know we can be.
And business lobby groups say the government has dropped the ball on genuine tax reform.
The one thing we did, though, envisage having was a 25% company tax rate to accompany it, along with some small business arrangements that people like me push very hard for. It's deeply disappointing. The company tax changes weren't tax cuts as much as tax reform.
The government is taking $7.5 billion in additional tax revenue and returning only about $2.5 billion of that per year to the business community through business tax relief. That is not sufficient to support a tax reform agenda that this country needs.
Not every single company or every single individual in the country is going to agree with this outcome. Not everybody will always embrace the idea of paying more tax.
The new regime will only apply to projects earning profits above $50 million a year. That means the number of companies covered by the new system has been reduced from 2,500 to 320. However, small miners say the threshold is no comfort to them, as they eventually aim to earn far more than that.
The majors are diversified. They're massive conglomerates they've got copper assets, nickel assets, zinc, all these, and coal and iron ore, and they've got all sorts of things all over the world in many different tax destinations. and they've got integrated businesses. So very sophisticated and quite advanced access to capital.
It's a similar story in the oil and gas industries, which will be brought under the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. Oil and gas analyst John Young says the new measures will have a bigger impact proportionately on small coal seam gas producers compared to the large internationals that have diversified operations.
The reason for that is the tax is struck and it just applies to one segment of the value chain, extracting the gas from the ground. So the small companies that are involved only in that segment actually will see a bigger percentage hit to their business.
John Young says while the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax is more onerous than the new minerals tax, it's a better deal for the energy industry than the original Resource Super Profits Tax.
Where the impact was going to be felt was for particularly the coal seam gas to LNG projects, because they were going to be developed under a favourable state royalty regime. The RSPT regime was actually fairly onerous, and there was an impact there. The PRRT regime is less severe. In fact, our numbers would suggest the impact's about half what the RSPT would have been.
The Association of Mining and Exploration Companies, or AMEC, will have its first meeting with the Resources Minister Martin Ferguson in Perth next week to discuss the new proposal. But they're disappointed they've been excluded from negotiations to date.
And we were asked to stop our protesting, to stop our campaigning on the basis that the AMEC would have a seat at the table to negotiate an outcome on the basis of a consensus. And AMEC was excluded. So what we've ended up with is government doing a deal with the big end of town.
You can't involve everyone, but the exclusion of industries outside coal and outside iron ore, and a $50 million threshold for companies in that regime are fairly significant windfalls for the smaller companies. So I think net-net they don't have too much to complain about.
BHP Billiton, Rio Tinto and Xstrata reached the agreement with the government, saying it represents very significant progress towards a regime that satisfies the industry's main principles. But the Minerals Council's Chief Executive, Mitchell Hook, rejects suggestions the big three companies struck a deal to suit themselves.
They were absolutely committed to ensuring that this was a position for the industry as a whole, that they met that principle of competitive neutrality. That is, that you don't do a deal, you don't allow tax policy to become a point of competitive differentiation across the industry.
Pengana Capital Fund Manager Tim Schroders says the original RSPT knocked around 20% off net present values of mining companies. While analysts will be looking for more certainty on how the new regime will apply in practice, it appears to be less destructive to shareholder wealth than the RSPT. And Tim Schroders says it will help repair perceptions of sovereign risk that arose when the RSPT took the mining industry and investors by surprise.
This is going to go a long, long way to alleviating those prior concerns where offshore investors probably put Australia in the sin bin for a couple of months as a result of the announced RSPT, and I think slowly but surely Australia will win back favour.
It will maintain Australia's standing as a competitive and attractive destination for investment and strengthen our economy for the future.
Julia Gillard's new deal received a practical endorsement from Xstrata as well, which will resume more than $500 million in expansion works on copper and coal mines in Queensland. Energy expansion plans like Santos's $20 billion liquefied natural gas projects in Queensland are also expected to be approved.
The fact that the proposal is now for PRRT, it's understood, then I think that does provide greater certainty. I think we're less likely to see potential delays to investment decisions. People can then move on, and take that decision and say, yes, we want to invest, or no, we don't, because we've got some certainty.
But Atlas Iron's David Flanagan says the residual uncertainty over the new scheme still means small resource firms face major obstacles.
Absolutely. I actually know of a couple of companies, I won't name them, but they actually went to the market to try and raise money recently and the doors were closed. So they don't want to so much promote that because that really damages their interest to sort of say they tried and failed. But that's the reality. That's happening almost every other week at the moment.
The hard work now will be in thrashing out the detail. That will be left to a panel chaired by former BHP Billiton chairman Don Argus, hardly comforting to those who argue the scheme already favours the big boys.